Okay, so today we are going to talk about a little bit different type of spring, and this is called a geyser. Here are the key concepts and or vocabulary that are going to be presented in this video. This is what I'm going to hold you accountable for as you watch this video. For today's notes presentation, here's what I would like you to do, and that is to copy these questions down right now into your notebook. And then as you go through the video, I want you to write the answers to these underneath each question. So leave a little bit of space. You can see there's only about 8 questions there. It's not a lot of material. So this will be a lot more effective in helping you score well on the quiz than just taking kind of scratch notes. So once again, pause the video right now, copy these terms into a page onto a page in your notebook, and then answer them as you go through the video.
So what we have here is a special type of hot spring. This is where water has come up out of the ground naturally, but instead of just sitting here on the surface, it is thrown into the air. The process by which this happens is the water seeps into the ground down there where it's hot. The water gets so hot that it turns to steam and builds up pressure and basically then explodes, which throws the water up into the air. This type of hot spring, this type of erupting hot spring is called a geyser. Geysers are always cyclical, which means they go through the same process constantly. After all of that water is thrown up in the air, it's eventually going to run out. The water will come back down and sit in this pool. But then it's going to seep back down into the ground where it will get hot enough again to erupt another time. So geysers always follow this pattern. This particular one is called Old Faithful of California because it's very faithful in how it erupts. It's very predictable that it's going to erupt about once every hour or so. That's about how long it takes for the water to seep back down into the ground, get hot enough again to where it can erupt up into the sky.
So let's define what a geyser is. A geyser is a type of spring, usually hot, but not always, where water erupts into the air. And the origin of this word geyser, it's not a Latin word, it's not a Greek word, it's not an English word, it's actually an Icelandic word. It comes from a verb, you can see it there, geyser in Icelandic, that means to gush, or a hot spring that gushes, especially up into the air. The reason why this is an Icelandic term, might be the only Icelandic term we have in our English language, is because that's where the first geyser was observed. So you can still go to the original geyser there in Iceland. Iceland is one big volcano. It's an island out in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. It has an incredible amount of heat under the ground. And it also rains a lot there. And the ground is really, really porous. So they get a lot of water in the ground. They got a lot of heat in the ground. So they have a ton of hot springs and subsequently geysers. And you see here's a picture of the original geyser right here. Let me show you what it looks like when this geyser erupts. So that's what a geyser looks like. It's obviously hot water. You can see the steam, but pressure builds up under the ground to the point that the water gets thrown into the air, sometimes in big bursts like that, or sometimes it can be a continuous stream, kind of like a fountain like you saw in the first video. Here's Little Geyser. And you see Little Geyser doesn't throw the water into the air as violently as the original geyser, or as that geyser that I showed you in the first presentation. But this is still classified as a geyser because it will throw water up into the air, at least periodically. So what happens with geysers? It's a pretty simple process. First you get rain, water has to fall to the ground, Then it infiltrates into the ground and it'll pool up. You'll have little collections of water under the ground. Think of it like this, like a little underwater cave. Well, the water gets hot and it basically it boils, and then it turns to steam. Steam builds up enough pressure to where it then has to be released, and the water gets pushed out of the surface. It's an erupting hot spring. The water isn't just hot. It basically explodes into the air, and it's going to come right back down and start that whole process again. So how do geysers work? Basically, water in the ground gets hot and it turns to steam. The steam builds up pressure and then pushes the water to the surface with such force that it gets shot into the air. This is the process by which geysers work. So a geyser is a type of hot spring because it's water coming out of the ground naturally and it's hot, but as opposed to your regular run-of-the-mill hot spring, it's a geyser because it gushes up into the air. It's thrown into the air when the water comes to the surface, as opposed to just kind of a regular hot spring where the water's just sitting there in a pool and it's hot. Here's the end of the end of the geyser. You see here the water's being thrown up into the air. As we watch it, it just kind of stops. This geyser has run out of pressure. All of the steam has forced the water out to the surface and it stops. Well, the water is going back down into the ground right now. And over a period of time, the water will get hot enough to where it then gets thrown into the air again. Go to see a geyser. A lot of them are very predictable because you can kind of guess, or you can look at the geyser and you can figure out, oh, okay, how long does it take for that to happen? From when it stops, how long until it erupts again? Because the length between eruptions is just dependent upon, well, how long does it take the water to go back into the ground? And how long does it take for it to get hot enough to where it builds up enough pressure and shoots into the air again? Geysers run on a cycle like that. And you can see this one here, they've got a sign there. This one's going to erupt between 8:30 and 10 o'clock because they kind of know it takes about that long for the water from the eruption to go back into the ground, get hot enough again to where it'll come back out the top. So this is what we call a steam vent, and it's like a geyser, it's like a hot spring, except it's so hot that the water comes to the surface as steam only, and you can see it's being pushed up into the air when it gets to the surface because it's steam, and we know that that hot air, hot steam is going to rise. So let's talk about these geysers. We've talked about how many springs there are, and we know that springs are everywhere. We talked about where do we find hot springs? Mostly in the western part of our country, and especially near volcanoes. Now, geysers, on the other hand, geysers are exceptionally rare. This map that I'm showing you right here, every one of those red dots represents the only known location of geysers. And you can see, if you think about worldwide, that's not that many. There are not that many geysers in the world, as opposed to, shoot, there are, 1,700 named hot springs in the United States alone. And there's 208 named cold water springs just in the state of Georgia. So both those occurrences are pretty common. Geysers are not. They're exceptionally rare. So how many of them are there in the world? About 1,000. Here's an example of one. This is a geyser in Japan. Japan is a big volcano. Also rains a lot. A lot of water going in the ground. Heat from a volcano makes the water hot and erupts to the surface. It's a big tourist attraction there because, like I said, you can't see geysers just anywhere. I showed you the video to introduce geysers. That was found in California. Here's one in New Zealand. One of the largest concentrations is in Russia. It's called the Valley of Geysers. And this is not my picture. I haven't been there. I'd love to go here, but it turns out this is a very remote location in Russia. This is not the kind of place people go to visit geysers and see them. Here's an example of Fly Geyser in Nevada, and this one's a little bit different because it erupts continuously, and this was kind of man-made. Somebody here was digging a well, and they were sinking a pipe down underground, and they hit a big underground reservoir of hot water. And it was so hot and had so much steam and it was pressurized that it immediately pushed the water to the surface. And it's been going ever since. I'd love to go here and visit this one. It's supposed to be exceptionally pretty. You can see the wild, crazy colors from all of these minerals that are coming to the surface, but it's on private property and you have to get special permission to go out there and see this, and it's exceptionally remote. But geysers, I showed you one in California. Here's one in Nevada. Here's one in Idaho. You can see it erupting over here, and this is actually a capped geyser where it's actually now controlled by man. They actually sunk a pipe in here and they actually have it on a timer. The geyser erupts every hour on the hour. They let pressure build up and then they release it every hour on the hour and the geyser erupts. So it's kind of cool. If you want to go see a geyser, you know you go there and you're going to see one at least within the hour.
So a geyser is a hot spring that builds up pressure under the ground to the point where it shoots the water in the air. And you can see that's what's happening back there behind me. The question should become, well, where do I find these things? We know that hot springs aren't that particularly rare. Even though they're found a lot more in the western part of the United States than in the east and on many other continents, hot springs aren't what you call a rare event. So what about these geysers? Well, as it turns out, there's only about 1,000 geysers or so on the entire Earth. And of those 1,000 geysers, roughly 75% of all of the world's geysers are found here, which is Yellowstone National Park in Wyoming.
So here's Yellowstone National Park, and you can see where it is on the map. It's in the corner of Wyoming, Montana, Idaho. It's not in a big city, but it's still easy enough to get to. If you want to see a geyser, you go to Yellowstone National Park because there's over 700 of them there, and it's a place you can drive to. It's no more difficult to get in your car and drive it in, as opposed to some of the other geyser locations on the planet that are a lot more remote.
All right, so what you see behind me here is a geyser. It's a hot spring that shoots water up into the air. This is the world's most famous geyser. This is Old Faithful in Yellowstone National Park. And it got the name Old Faithful because it was very predictable and very regular about when it erupted. It erupts about every 94 minutes or so, because that's how long it takes for the water to run out and then sink back into the ground and get hot again to the point where it erupts. So once again, this is Old Faithful Geyser here in Yellowstone National Park.
So what does it mean when we say a faithful geyser? A faithful geyser are ones where their schedules are very regular and very predictable. Old Faithful, like I just showed you, erupts I think about every 94 minutes or so, and that's within about 10 minutes. So right there where you go and you view Old Faithful, it's a very popular tourist attraction in Yellowstone National Park. They have a sign there. As soon as the eruption stops, as soon as the water stops coming out of the ground, the ranger will go over here to this sign. He'll look at his watch and say, okay, the eruption ended at this time. the next eruption is going to be about this time. And it's plus or minus 10 minutes or so. And it's surprisingly accurate. Old Faithful used to be a lot more regular. It actually used to be more exact than plus or minus 10 minutes. It used to be you could almost set your watch by it. But there was an earthquake, like are common in that area, and it messed with Old Faithful's plumbing a little bit. So the timing of Old Faithful isn't as faithful as it used to be, but it's still pretty good. So it's kind of neat that you go there and you can look at the sign and see, okay, well, when's the geyser going to erupt? You don't have to sit around and wait all day to see it. You know when it's going to happen. And there you can see it erupting there. Another shot of what Old Faithful erupting looks like. You can't get that close to it because it shoots boiling hot water so high and so far into the air, it gets a little dangerous to get close to it. So there in Yellowstone National Park with all these geysers, they've got a predictions chart set up there, and you can go up to Visitor Center. You can see, okay, Old Faithful's going to erupt at 9. Castle's at 9:15. You can see they'll tell you the next time they think it's going to erupt. And sure enough, I went around visiting the parks, and then I came across this one. Now, Giant Geyser isn't so faithful. It's definitely not a faithful geyser because you can see its last eruption was in March 2019. It's very unpredictable. It is not a faithful geyser. It still erupts, but nobody knows or can predict when it's going to happen. So there are said to be 3 faithful geysers in the world. There's Old Faithful in California. That's the one I showed you at the beginning of the presentation. Old Faithful in Yellowstone National Park. And then there's one in New Zealand. It was in the area, the one that I showed you the picture of, that is very, very regular. They are considered to be faithful geysers because they're very faithful in their routines. There's Old Faithful of California. Now, how big do these geysers get? Steamboat Geyser is the world's tallest, and they can shoot water up to about 380 feet in the air. Now, this picture over here, I took this summer when I was in Yellowstone, and I got there, and they never know when Steamboat's going to erupt. It is not a very faithful geyser, but there are some indicators. As it turns out, the day before I was there, I saw Steamboat Geyser erupting, but I saw it from the road. It looked something like this. I was driving through the park, and I wasn't planning to go to that geyser base, and I looked over and kind of above the trees, I saw something like you see in that picture, even though that's not my exact picture. I saw this big plume of water and steam coming out of the sky, and I realized right then, hey, that's kind of over there where Steamboat Geyser is. It's the world's tallest, and it doesn't erupt very regularly. So I felt very lucky to be able to have witnessed it. The next day, when I went and I took this picture, and I was walking around Steamboat Geyser, I was looking in the pools of hot springs that are around the bottom of it, and they were all empty because the Steamboat Geyser had sucked out all the water out of the hot springs and thrown it into the air. And Steamboat Geyser won't erupt again until there's some more rain, fills up those hot springs, and they get hot enough to build up pressure and steam and erupt. Now, not all geysers are hot. There are some very rare geysers that are called cold water geysers. And it's not the heat that turns the water to steam that makes it erupt. What happens here is we get water infiltrating into the ground, and we know that the water will pick up minerals. Well, this is a carbonate-based rock, and when the water reacts with it, you can get carbon dioxide, CO2. That's the stuff that goes into sodas that makes them fizzy, carbon dioxide. So what happens is the water gets down here and it brings a bunch of carbon dioxide down there, and it ends up being like a huge pressurized can of soda. Well, once the carbon dioxide level builds up enough pressure and it starts to push, it will push the water to the surface and the geyser will erupt. And this is called a cold water geyser, where the water is being pushed to the surface not by the heat and pressure caused by it turning to steam, but by gases, specifically carbon dioxide. It's like opening a can of soda and having it fizz. Now, geysers can go extinct, just like we talked about how springs can dry up. Geysers can die. Here is one in Yellowstone National Park. This used to be a geyser. Water used to come out the top and be shot up into the air. And you can see over time, every time the geyser throws water in the air, it would pile up some minerals. This was like the cone or the funnel where the nozzle of a hose where the water is coming out. Well, something happened with the underground plumbing. Earthquakes, water paths changed, and it ran out of water. Well, the cone of minerals, the spout of the geyser, is still there. But this is a geyser that's gone extinct. It's not spitting out water anymore. Something has happened that its water supply has been cut off. The Great Fountain Geyser says NA, it's not going to erupt, because they're thinking maybe that one's going extinct now that something's happening and it doesn't have the juice, it doesn't have the water anymore to erupt as a geyser. Now, something else can happen. There was a set of geysers in Nevada, and what they did was they came and they built this thing here. They collected the hot water from under the ground and they used it to make electricity. They were using the steam from the hot water to make electricity. The problem was that cut down the pressure in the hot spring that caused the water to come to the surface. So now the underground hot spring has too low of pressure to be able to push the water to the surface, because the electric plant is taking too much of the steam to make electricity. So this is a man-made situation where geysers can go extinct because we start messing with the plumbing. Another thing that can happen with a geyser to go extinct is something can happen to the water table. If the water table gets too low, well, it runs on water. It's fueled by water. You're not going to have any water coming out the top anymore. Also, if the area gets cold, remember, you got to have a really, really strong heat source to turn that water to steam to build up enough pressure to shoot the water into the air. So a geyser can go extinct if the ground gets too cold, if it loses heat, because then it won't generate enough steam to push the water to the surface. There's a lot of cases where a geyser is now just a hot spring. The water's still hot, but it's not hot enough to throw it up into the air. So let's review those key concepts in the vocabulary. Hopefully you have been able to answer these questions as you went through the video. What I need you to do at this point is you take a picture of these questions with the answers written down in your notebook, submit those to Teams for your daily grade for today, and we'll have a short quiz on the content of this presentation tomorrow.